Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. If you have just tuned in, you are watching Morning Rush. Today being Wednesday, the 3rd of February 2016, the Islamic date, the 23rd of Rabi'ul Akhir 1437. As we promised yesterday in studio, we are privileged to be hosting a US investigative journalist and author of an upcoming book entitled Tomorrow's Battlefield. And we have in studio this morning Nick Turse, who is an award-winning journalist and historian, also an author and editor of several books, including The Changing Face of Empire, Special Ops, Drones, Spies, Proxy Fighters, Secret Bases, and Cyber Warfare. If you're a gamer, this would sound like a Call of Duty editions. We say good morning to Nick Turse, and thank you for joining us here at ITV Networks.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on today.
Thank you. Nick, firstly, let's get on to the crux of the matter. We see you are launching a book. You are in South Africa giving lectures in various cities, Johannesburg, Durban, and Cape Town. And we see your book entitled Tomorrow's Battlefield, the United States Proxy Wars and Secret Ops in Africa. Do you want to tell our viewers about the book called Tomorrow's Battlefield?
Sure. Maybe the best place to start is the title. Tomorrow's Battlefield really isn't... it's a title that I came up with because I heard this phrase used by the U.S. military. A few years ago, I got a hold of a video of a closed-door ceremony among some of the leaders of America's most elite forces in Africa, U.S. Special Operations Forces. And one of these men talked about what his boss, a General Linder, that's his name, calls Africa. He said that Africa is the battlefield of tomorrow today. And this, it really shocked me, because if you talk to U.S. military leaders in Africa on the record, they say that they're not doing very much in Africa, that it's very benign, humanitarian missions, that sort of thing. But to call it the battlefield of tomorrow today, it tells you that behind the scenes they think about Africa very differently. They think about it as a war.
Definitely. But we also see you made mention in the United States proxy wars. Do you want to take our viewers what's a proxy war all about?
Sure. The United States, after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or at least the first iteration, there was an idea to back away from these large footprint operations. Instead of having major occupations, try and do it a lot lighter footprint. More special operations forces, more drones, and try and get locals to fight your wars for you. So, since 9/11, since 2001, the United States has spent a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, into the billions, propping up forces across Africa, trying to make them, these countries, bulwarks against terrorism on the continent. Hoping that these forces can fight wars so that the U.S. can have a lighter footprint.
All right, before we go on to AFRICOM that you make mention in the book, I just want to piggyback on what you just made mention, that they've invested billions of dollars in groups or locals. Then do we see the rise of so-called Boko Haram and these militia groups? Are these the after effects of America's involvement?
Well, it's always tough to separate correlation from causation, but if you look at major U.S. interventions, you see that oftentimes what they were, attempting to go for, the results that they were looking for, just haven't come through. We can look at something like the intervention in Libya. The United States joined a coalition war there, backing rebels on the ground, and then a lot of outside forces, NATO and others. And after the fall of Gaddafi, after he was killed, the United States was touting this as a major victory and possibly a template for other wars. Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at the time for us and now presidential candidate, she hailed this as a new model of U.S. warfare, a way that we could fight wars on the cheap in two ways: less expensive and also less expensive in American lives. No body bags coming home. Most Americans didn't even realize we were at war in any way, and this makes it easy for them to fight wars like this. Of course, we've seen what's resulted in Libya from in the time since. No one is talking about Libya as a template for the way anyone wants to see wars fought now, and not only has it destabilized Libya and led to a rise of terror groups and militias, but neighboring countries, Mali for one, suffered mightily as a result. Tuareg rebels who had worked for Gaddafi looted his weapons stores, moved back into their native Mali, and then they started to carve out their own homeland in the north. They were defeating an army that the United States had spent over $100 million building up over the previous decade. That army was disintegrating. An officer that the United States had trained in the United States, he'd come to America, trained there. He decided he could do a better job, overthrew the democratically elected government in Mali, but he proved just as hapless. Some Islamist fighters moved in, pushed aside the Tuaregs, and were defeating his Malian army. And the United States decided to launch, or back a different proxy war there, a joint African and French force. They arrested the complete disintegration of Mali, but now it's been in a state of insurgency ever since. There are constant attacks on UN peacekeepers there. We saw a major terrorist strike in the capital, Bamako, late last year on a luxury hotel. And some of the fighters from the war in Mali have spread out across Africa. Some went back into Libya, and the arms that came out of Gaddafi stockpiles have spread across the continent. We see them some in the hands of Boko Haram now, and of course that war is spread out of Nigeria into Chad, Cameroon, Niger. So the unintended consequences of that Libyan intervention, you see it has repercussions for the entire region. Yes.
In your opinion, then, has the United States not learned from history? We see they backed in the 1980s the Afghanistan invasion. They backed Afghanistan within the Russian war. We see that how that turned against them eventually. Have they not learned their lesson?
Yeah, my country seems very resistant to learning any lessons. Again and again, the United States sees military interventions as the one and only solution. Of course, when you've cut back the State Department, our diplomatic corps, there's not much money going to that. The Pentagon, our Defense Department, really runs the show. And they really have only one tool in their toolkit, and that's hammers. So everywhere they look, they happen to see nails. Yeah. It's just the only response.
Looking at the book, Nick, we see the term AFRICOM being mentioned quite prevalent in the book. Do you want to take our viewers through what is AFRICOM all about?
Sure. It stands for, it's an acronym for U.S. Africa Command. This is one of a number of what the United States calls geographic combatant commands around the world. So this is the umbrella organization for all U.S. military activity on the African continent. After 9/11, the United States started taking a close look at Africa and decided that it was a place where there might be terror activity. And they launched this campaign or the command in 2008. When AFRICOM first came on the scene, it inherited about 172 exercises, activities, and operations on the continent. Previously, they'd been run from different commands. Now it was all under one umbrella. In the time since, these activities on the continent have grown exponentially. The last year for which we have good numbers is 2014, and that year there were 674, operations on the continent. So a 300% increase since Africa came into being, or AFRICOM came into being. So this is, it's been a major expansion, and this command has brought more U.S. troops to the continent and a proliferation of bases as well.
You are watching A Morning Rush, today being the 3rd of Rabiul Akhir 1437, and in studio we are privileged to be hosting U.S. investigative journalist who is brought into the country by AMAC, the Africa Middle East Center, and we'll be back after this short break.